Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Getting Real with Claudia and Jose.
This is obviously Claudia, and I'm Jose, and together we're part of the Castillo Pardo group in Toronto. Today we're exploring the things that buyers usually overlook when buying a property in Toronto. Is what you see, what you get?
You're about to find out.
Okay, here's the first commonly asked question. Does this house have parking?
It depends. It depends. Like
Okay.
many times, when you look at a property on the multiple listing service as the MLS, it says house has parking, yes, marked as parking, and then there's another area that says drive. So it's showing if the house has parking through a mutual driveway, or if it has a private lane, or if it has a lane at the back where you can park. So you need to look at these items before making that decision. Or once you visit the house, you have to realize if it really does, because sometimes you do have a mutual driveway that allows you to park the car at the back, but your car can't even fit the mutual driveway.
Yeah, so just so you can better understand, a mutual drive is a section between both houses that is shared. So many times you have a mutual drive and you have a remark in the listing that says that the sellers have an agreement with a neighbor and they use on and off park there for 15 days of the month, and the other 15 days the neighbor parks. But what happens if that neighbor moves? What happens if the neighbor decides not to continue with the agreement? It's a great arrangement for parking, but you have to be aware that that is not proper parking assigned to the home.
It's not even legal.
Well, it's an arrangement between the neighbors, so if
But that doesn't
nobody
mean that you can
objects,
obstruct it.
then basically there shouldn't be an
Agreed.
issue.
Yeah, great.
So another one would be front pad parking. Many times you see a curb cut in the sidewalk. There's a space where you can fit a car in the front yard. But does this really mean that you have a legal front yard parking?
Yeah, not necessarily. You have to make sure that you check that location, the address, has licensed parking and that it's active. Many times what we hear from some agents or sellers is that, oh, well, it's okay. I've been parking there for all my life. I've lived here for 20 years. I park there. There's no issue with that. But then when you go back and check if the property has
There's a front pad parking registry.
if you check that register and you check if the address has a licensed spot parking, they don't. So you don't have parking. Because the city, once there's a transfer of home ownership, they can come back, inspect the area for parking, and then realize that you really don't have parking, so you're not allowed. And they're going to ask you to put something in that location so you can park a car.
The context of this is that the front yard parking license doesn't run with the property; it runs with the ownership. So if at some point the owner stops paying for the license, or for whatever reason it wasn't legal from the beginning, then although you have the physical ability to park the car in that front yard section, it's not necessarily legal. So you have to check. One would be verify if the owner has been paying for the license. Second, there's an online registry for a front yard parking in which you can check the address to see if there's if this is a licensed location.
And that is still active, because many people put the offer and they check that after the offer is accepted. But the fact is that you want to look at all these things before you even put an offer in writing or offer for that property.
If you need parking and you want to make sure that it's there. And the other one would be, once you do complete the purchase and you have verified that the front yard parking is legal, then you have to contact the city and
the off-street parking service.
Yeah.
Office.
In order to
the off-street parking office.
Okay, in order to fill out an application and be able to continue to pay and keep it.
And that's another important thing. The fact that you have the front parking doesn't mean that it's for free. You still have to pay. It's a very low fee, but you still have to pay for it.
So you could be able to find out beforehand what would be the amount. Usually it's a couple $100 per year, so I don't think it's a big cost, but just be aware that there is a cost associated.
We've had situations in which we are talking to our clients who are looking for a house, and we visit a property that's a corner lot. So it looks fantastic. You go in, you look at the backyard is amazing, it's huge. The fence is in good condition. And then you go and inspect a little bit further or you look at the survey, there's one, or you look at the history of the property, and then you realize that at some point the fence in the backyard was moved towards the right or the left, or north, south, east, west. And you ask a little bit more about that, and then you realize that fence is outside of the property line and onto public space. So of course, when you look at the property looks huge and the backyard is very big. But let's say the lot is supposed to be 18 feet. Because they moved that fence, they maybe use 3 more feet onto the public area, and now it's 21 feet, but it's really not 21 feet. So if you don't look into these items before you present the offer, or even after closing takes place, you are in for a huge heartbreak because your backyard is not the size that you thought it was going to be, and then you can't use the whole space as you intended to.
And this usually could be a concern if you're planning on doing a pool, if you're planning on creating a structure, because you could be able to do it on your property based on whatever guidelines are in place, but you can't be able to build on the municipal land that you're like sort of encroaching onto. So that would be something that let's say, for example, you would be looking at a survey. Many times the surveys are not up to date, so they might not reflect the exact boundaries of the property if something has changed. But just keep in mind, like what you physically see, you have to confirm through a survey that those boundaries are there. Like if it's 18 feet on the survey and basically the width of the house now is 23 feet, then probably part of that land is not yours to use. Many times the city won't come in and do an inspection, but just keep in mind, if you want to build a structure, or if at some point the city does look into this, it could be able to limit the use of the space that you're physically seeing.
And and that's a very good point that you brought with the swimming pools, because we had a situation also, and it relates more to the house being located in an area that at the back has a ravine or a protected area. Many people, many buyers do not even look into these aspects of a property when they're buying their house because they don't know about this. That many properties will have
Archaeological value.
archaeological value at the back, or you cannot touch part of the ravine, or you cannot do build certain structures in your backyard because that affects the water flow or things that are around in the green areas. So you also need to make sure. Many people don't realize, and this happens very often, that swimming pool that you want to build might not be possible just because you can't build on those locations because of certain rights because of certain aspects that you need to keep in mind before they're built. So there are also websites in which from the government that you can check and make sure that everything that you're seeing in that location is what you're going to get.
Indicators would be check how your backyard or that structure compares to the neighbors. Like if you see that many of the neighbors have the same depth in the structure, or if you have a lot of like decks or gazebos or whatnot built, that probably indicates that probably it is legal. But if you're the only one that has a pool or a deck or a fence in the backyard and everybody else doesn't, so like that would be something that you want to check. That like if the backyard of that house has structures or things different to the neighbors, you want to make sure that there were permits that were pulled or that there's authorization for them to be doing that.
I think that more than red flags, sometimes it's also common sense. If you see a ravine at the back of your house and you're like, yeah, it's amazing, we have a ravine. But then with ravines, many other things come attached. And that's when you have to, like, as an agent, I would tell my buyer, there's a ravine, wonderful, but we will have to check if there's any other things to consider, limitations that you will have if you plan to buy the house and build a gazebo or build a pool. So it comes down to you being able to identify certain locations or things that are around the property. Like, for example, the Ontario line right now. Many properties around the Ontario line might get affected by the construction. So whenever you buy a house, you also want to check where that house is located in relation to the location of the Ontario line. So if it's within the 30-meter space or the right-of-way for Metrolinx to conduct their work, you want to make sure that you are aware of that and what that entails. And you can ask Metrolinx and you can ask the Ontario line people, hey, what if I buy this property and I want to make these renovations that imply me touching public grounds? Because most likely you're going to have to ask for an additional permit. So
Additional to
the one that you have to ask for regular permits in your property. So again, it's knowing what's going on in the city. If I have a hydro corridor at the back, what does that entail for my property in terms of value? What does that entail for me in terms of what I want to do at the back in the backyard? So yeah, not more than red flags is being aware of the location, being aware of what you have around, what is happening with in terms of development, and going to the right sources to look for that information and make sure that you're not in for trouble or a huge loss of value
And
when
also,
you could have avoided it.
you have the train tracks. Like sometimes you're close, like there's a property that backs onto a train track. Sometimes it could be the GO train, so there's a limited service, but sometimes it could be the freight line. So that runs 24 hours, and that runs like a significant with significant noise. So many times you want to be aware that if there are train tracks, like what trains are running through that line, and how much of a proximity you have, how much noise and vibration could be originating from it. So those are things to keep in mind when you're buying a home as well.
Yeah, another one would be you want your house to be quiet and peaceful and everything is perfect. And then you realize that you are 1 block away from the subway line. So you didn't realize during showings that the subway that runs every 20 minutes because you just visited the house for 15 minutes or 10, you couldn't see or you couldn't feel the vibration in the basement. So if you are aware that you live close to a subway line, just stay a little bit longer or ask for 1 hour showing so you can stay a little bit longer in the property and then realize what is really happening. And it's not that you're not going to buy it or the property is not going to sell. It will sell. Be aware because over time, this can also affect value. And if you present an offer for that property, you'll also want to include in that price whatever increase or decrease that you might get, which is difficult to measure, but it will be there because of that situation. Which leads us into what to look for inside of the home.
Because you want to know if what you see is what you get. Many times when visiting a property, we see a property that's beautifully staged, and the buyers are looking at how great it feels. But I think that we normally would recommend that buyers look critically at the house, like go beyond the furniture. Also, like turn off the lights. You want to know how bright this house is. Obviously, if it's a cloudy day, it's not going to be as bright. But when you come in, you want to know like is this house facing south or west, which you're going to get like decent amount of light throughout the winter. How well lit the property is, natural light. The other one would be if you're attached, like how nosy might your neighbors be. If the property is staged, you want to like look under the carpet. You want to look behind the furniture. You want to check the age of the windows. Like there are many things that you want to look for in a house that when you're doing the final inspection and there's no furniture in the property, you're not surprised by things that you have overlooked during the initial showing. For example, we had a situation in which we were doing the closing on a property and we were doing the inspection 24 hours before. The seller had delayed their move. They actually moved on closing date, which is a big no-no for sellers. But when we did the pre-closing inspection, the furniture was there. We weren't able to notice that once the furniture was removed and the seller had moved out, there were 3 big stains on the living room floor. So these would be things that we would have to check with the lawyer and the seller to try to be able to compensate or remediate. But once the closing takes place, it's fairly difficult to get them to agree to it.
Like, how commonly does that happen?
It can no, but it can happen. It can happen, which is why it's recommended that during the visits you kind of like it's difficult to move big pieces of furniture. You can't. But if that's the case and there's an issue on the floor, then the seller should have disclosed. The situation is making sure that on closing or even after closing takes place, the lawyers can actually do something about it because it's hard to. I mean, we know it's there, and the sellers are not obligated to disclose those things unless they represent
Danger.
a danger to the buyer.
Yeah, but they can't hide it either. Like if it's there, it should be visible for the buyer to see. Like a buyer's not going to be
Yeah,
like
but
moving
if the
everything
sofa,
around.
if the sofa is there, that doesn't mean that they necessarily did it on purpose to hide
Yeah,
it,
that's true.
right? So it's hard to. It's just like you're not gonna be removing the whole thing. It's just you do your best to inspect and make sure that things are in good condition. But if in the end something like that comes up, it's hard for you to know if there was a huge piece of furniture. Questions that you can ask are, for example, has there been any water damage while the owner owned the property, or when they bought the property, was there any damage that they noticed?
You can
And if you ask, they should respond fairly and honestly.
and you can ask like, is there anything about the property that I should know?
That too,
That's
but I
another
think,
question.
but I think being more intentional and direct with water damage, because water damage is a huge thing. It's like if there was water damage in some area of the property, and there was not only the damage on the floors, but there is also mold that was created and that wasn't remediated. That also creates a health issue. So you want to make sure you ask these specific questions to make sure that if that's important to you, you will not have issues with that, or that you, whatever you buy, you're aware that there was some water damage or another type of damage, and you're okay with buying the property in the way it is.
Yeah, because that could impact your insurance. When you want to apply for insurance, there could be a claim, and that could be an issue.
And not only that, it happened to me with a client, a buyer client. At some point, it was a condo that we were buying. And when they were going to get their insurance for the condo, the insurer said there is a water damage claim on that property. And we were like,
What?
so what? My question was, that was even before closing, because they were like finding out about what to do in terms of insurance. When we talked with the listing agent, I was direct asking, we had this back from the insurer and they say there is a water claim. What happened in the property? The listing agent didn't even know. He hadn't asked his client either. And again, the client didn't need to disclose. And sometimes you don't even need to disclose if the issue was completely resolved. If it's solved, it's okay. But if this had created something else for my buyer over time, then that would have been an issue. So you want to make sure you have all the information. And even if that was the case, there was water damage, it was solved, there's no issues now, everything was remediated, there was no mold, there's nothing else, then that's okay. But if it isn't, at least you're aware of it.
So when you look at properties that are renovated, or you see some changes that have taken place between the pictures in the previous listings and how it looks now, especially like if there are walls that have been removed, kitchens that have been opened, plumbing or electrical that has been changed, you always want to try and find out if they pulled permits for that work. Many times, either a seller does it as a do-it-yourself a project, and they basically don't get permits, or they hire a contractor, and they don't go through the process of applying for permits.
If you're worried about the way things were done inside, or if you want to know if there were permits, and when you obtain the impact report, those permits don't show there and doesn't say anything about what happened in the area, you can also go to a city website where you can look for the address and it's going to show the permits that have been issued for that. But not every house has all the permits in that website. So again, if you want to make sure and be super sure about this, you have to go directly to the city. And there's a specific department that takes care of this. And then you can ask about the permits for that property. That's the only way to really be 100% certain that permits were obtained, if permits were required. And the city has a very comprehensive website and information online where they say what requires a permit and what not. So just make sure. Sometimes people work with contractors who want to avoid getting the permits, and they come up
The inspections
and
have
they
to.
come up with all these things saying, yeah, well, you don't require, it's okay. You don't require a permit because
We're just opening this joist and just putting some plumbing in it.
you want to make things right. Because if at some point you want to make a renovation and an inspector from the city comes for that renovation, they might also go back to what was done,
Or see something that
doesn't go to code, or is not complying with what was supposed to be done. You might be liable, or you might be responsible
to bring it back to the original state.
what it was originally, or improving or doing it properly. So that's going to be a highly cost. So it's all about risk, and you don't want to get into situations that you don't want to deal
Like
with.
you want to minimize risk by doing due diligence before you actually
Doing
buy
things
the property.
right. You just have to do things right. I think in terms of zoning is more, sometimes people might think that they can build additions or more onto a property, and they can't, because there is a certain ratio and lot coverage that you have to respect, and you will not be allowed to go over that ratio. So people need to, like, once a buyer buys a property and says, oh, well, I can add a third floor, a fourth floor, you can't promise that, because you have to go through a process of really verifying with the city if zoning, you can also look at zoning, but you have to be very versed in how the codes work for you to advise properly your clients. So you have to make sure you talk to the right professionals about all these things. So if that's important to your buyer client, or to the person who's buying the property, You have to make sure you go to the right people, because these things might be out of the scope of our expertise and we might not be able to, although we can have our opinion on it, we cannot advise or make that advice legal advice.
Yeah, and basically the experts would be, you could talk to a contractor and get an idea. Once you do the visits, you can talk to an architect. An architect would tell you, like, probably you would have to talk to a structural engineer. So like there's insight that you could be able to get, but it just depends on how much interest and how quickly that property sells in order for you to do the due diligence.
So you have to make sure that you do all of this before you put the offer in writing, because once it's accepted and you're buying whatever it get accepted.
Today, we hope that we gave you a good glimpse of what to look for as a buyer when buying a home in Toronto. We're going to continue doing what?
We're going to be interviewing lawyers, inspectors, contractors, experts in these matters that will provide you with a better idea of what to look for when you're buying a property, because many times what you see is not what you get.
Thank you so much for joining us in this episode of Getting Real with Claudia and Jose, and we look forward to seeing you in the next one.